The ballroom of the Crestfield Hotel held 300 guests that evening, all of them dressed in the language of money, the particular vocabulary of people who understood that the right fabric, the right watch, the right table at the right charity gala communicated more than any resume or title ever could. When Marcus Aldine's wife stood up from her chair at table 7 and announced, in a voice that carried across the nearest 4 tables without any apparent effort, that she had decided to end their marriage, she was performing for exactly this audience. She had chosen this room, this evening, this specific moment between the salad course and the entree, because she believed that maximum witnesses guaranteed maximum devastation. She had miscalculated everything. What would you do if the person who claimed to love you chose the grandest, most public stage available to throw you away? Stay with us, because Marcus Aldine's quiet response to that moment was only the beginning of a reckoning that would strip his wife and her family of absolutely everything they had spent years pretending they deserved. If this kind of story speaks to you, hit that like button right now and subscribe. You will not want to miss a single moment of what comes next. And before we go further, where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments below. We have an incredible audience tuning in from all over the world, and hearing from you genuinely means everything to this channel. The Crestfield Hotel occupied the top 3 floors of a tower in the financial district, and the annual Crestfield Gala was the kind of event that people in Diane Aldine's social circle talked about for months in either direction. The weeks leading up to it, a rehearsal for status. The weeks following it, an autopsy. Tickets were $4,000 per couple. The stated beneficiary was a children's literacy initiative that received approximately 18% of the proceeds after the venue, the catering, and the entertainment were accounted for. This was understood by most of the guests but never mentioned, because the point of the gala was not literacy. The point was the room. Diane had bought the tickets herself with a credit card that Marcus paid the balance on each month without comment. She had selected his evening wear, a charcoal suit, well cut, the kind that looked expensive without being conspicuous, because she had very specific ideas about the visual harmony of their appearance as a couple. What she was presenting to the room mattered to her in a way that left very little room for anything else. Marcus had driven them there in the car he had owned for 4 years, a practical, reliable vehicle that Diane sometimes referred to as that thing when speaking to her mother on the phone. He had heard her say it. He had added it to the long internal inventory he kept of these moments, not out of bitterness but out of a kind of sorrowful precision. He was a man who noticed things accurately and recorded them honestly, which was, as it happened, a professional trait as much as a personal one. His jacket pocket contained a small USB drive. It was no larger than a finger joint, matte black, entirely unremarkable. It had been there for 11 days, carried with him everywhere he went, the way you carry something you are not yet ready to do anything with, but are absolutely not willing to leave behind. Marcus Aldine was 40 years old and had worked as a forensic accountant for 15 years, the last 7 of which he had spent employed by a firm called Aldine & Partners, a firm that bore his name because he had founded it alone at 33 with 2 clients, a sublet office, and the particular, quiet confidence of a man who knows precisely what he is capable of, even when no one around him appears to. The firm now employed 22 people. It had a substantial client list and an industry reputation built entirely on the quality of its work. Marcus had never discussed this at a dinner party. He did not own a conspicuous watch or drive an impressive car. He dressed well and moderately and spoke only when he had something worth saying, which meant that people who did not listen carefully tended to underestimate him with a thoroughness that was, in retrospect, always their problem. His wife had been underestimating him since approximately the 3rd year of their marriage, which was when the warmth in her voice had begun its slow, imperceptible withdrawal. By year 5, she had stopped asking about his work. By year 6, she had developed the habit of talking over him at dinner parties with the effortless confidence of someone who had long since decided that nothing he was contributing was worth the interruption cost. He had noticed all of it. He had stayed as patient people stay, not out of weakness, but out of a genuine belief that a promise made deserved more than a convenient exit. He had been wrong to stay that long, but the wrongness was on Diane's account entirely. The Hardcastle family occupied the adjacent social universe that Diane had been working to position herself inside since before Marcus had met her. Rosalind Hardcastle was Diane's mother, a woman of 61 who had the bearing of a former beauty, who had decided, upon reaching the age where beauty began its inevitable negotiation with time, to substitute authority for it, and found the exchange entirely satisfactory. She wore authority the way younger women wore jewelry, constantly, deliberately, as a signal of intent. She had looked at Marcus Aldine at his own wedding to her daughter and seen a promising enough vehicle who would require significant management. She had spent 7 years managing him, or believing she was, which amounted to the same level of self-satisfaction. Rosalind's son, Diane's younger brother, was a man named Broderick Hardcastle, who went by Brock, and who had been telling people for 6 years that he was a real estate developer. He had developed one property in those 6 years. The rest of his time had been spent on the appearance of development, the meetings, the lunches, the proposals, the deals about to close that never quite seemed to complete. He drove a car that cost more than Marcus's annual draw in the firm's early years and wore sunglasses indoors with the conviction of a man who had confused confidence with theatre. He had never liked Marcus and said so to Diane regularly in terms that were not subtle. He called Marcus the bookkeeper when speaking to their mutual acquaintances, which he believed was devastating and which was in fact merely accurate in the most reductive way possible. Table 7 at the Crestfield Gala held 8 guests: Marcus and Diane, Rosalind, Brock and his girlfriend Waverley, and 3 couples from Diane's professional circle, whose presence was calculated to maximize the number of witnesses. Marcus had looked around the table when they sat down and understood, with the clear, indexing intelligence that was his professional gift, that the configuration was not accidental. He had looked at Diane across the table and caught something in her expression. A tightness beneath the social smoothness, a deliberateness. And he had reached into his jacket pocket and touched the USB drive with one finger, very briefly, the way you might touch something solid when the ground beneath you feels uncertain. He had left it there and waited. The salad was excellent. The wine was poured with the practiced attentiveness of staff accustomed to people who would notice if it wasn't. The conversation around the table followed its expected currents. Brock holding court about a deal in the north of the city, Rosalind offering her opinions on the decor, and the guest list with the proprietorial ease of a woman who considered the world a property she was perpetually renovating, Diane smiling and angling and performing the version of herself that this room required. Then the salad plates were cleared. The entree was announced. The bustle of the service created a brief, natural interruption in the conversation, and Diane placed her linen napkin on the table beside her plate, smoothed it once, and stood up. She was 38 years old, and she was, in that moment, extremely beautiful, in the way of a woman fully armored with the belief in her own power. She looked around the table with a composed, unhurried gaze, ensuring everyone was attending, and then she looked at Marcus. "I have decided to end our marriage," she said, perfectly timed, perfectly placed. A public announcement designed to leave him precisely nowhere to put himself. Rosalind nodded once, as though confirmation had arrived on schedule. Brock reached for his wine with an expression of studied neutrality that contained a considerable amount of satisfaction. Waverley looked at her plate. The three couples from Diane's professional circle sat very still, performing the social equivalent of being invisible, present enough to witness, composed enough to avoid being implicated. Marcus looked at his wife for a long moment. The room continued its enormous indifferent noise around them, 300 people eating, drinking, performing, fundraising in name, the world proceeding with complete disregard for the moment happening at table 7. "All right," Marcus said, quiet, even, the voice of a man who was neither surprised, nor breaking, nor particularly distressed. The voice of a man who was, in fact, holding something in his jacket pocket that entirely changed the geometry of this moment, and who understood this so completely that no performance was required. The composure in those two words, the absolute, unruffled stillness of them, was not what Diane had prepared for. She had prepared for distress, for a plea or an argument, or the particular public unravelling that would confirm everything she had been implying to her mother for the past year about the kind of man she had married. She had not prepared for calm. She had not prepared for a man who looked entirely, almost inconveniently all right. Something flickered in her expression, too fast to name. Then Rosalind spoke, the bright, proprietary lift of a woman claiming a victory, and the moment was buried beneath the conversation that followed. Marcus finished his entree. He was present and courteous through the remainder of the evening. He drove them home in the car that Diane called "that thing," and she spoke to her phone most of the journey, and he drove with both hands on the wheel and looked at the road and thought about the USB drive. He had known about the affair for 4 months. The man's name was Elliot Rain. He was 44, divorced, and the chief financial officer of Hardcastle Ventures, which was the umbrella company under which Rosalind managed her property investments, and Brock managed his theatrical approximation of a career. Elliot had joined the company 2 years prior, brought in by Rosalind on the recommendation of a mutual contact, and had made himself indispensable with the kind of smooth, ingratiating efficiency that certain people deploy as a professional survival strategy. He had also been conducting a relationship with Diane for approximately 7 months, which predated Marcus's knowledge by 3 months. He drove an impressive car. He wore the same category of confident, expensive ease that Brock performed, but with more facility, the ease of someone who had genuinely been educated in a certain environment rather than someone imitating their idea of it. He was precisely the type that Rosalind found reassuring, and Diane had been trained since girlhood to find compelling. Marcus had discovered it the way careful people discover most things, not through drama or confrontation, but through a pattern of observations that accumulated to a conclusion too precise to dismiss. A name mentioned once too often, a particular quality of attention on Diane's phone, a schedule that contained new irregularities. He had said nothing. He had simply become more observant and more patient, and the observations had brought him 6 weeks later to a very different discovery entirely. He had been reviewing Hardcastle Ventures accounts. This was not unusual. Aldine and Partners had handled forensic accounting work for several clients adjacent to the Hardcastle family's business interests, and in the course of a routine engagement for one of those clients, Marcus had been given access to a tranche of financial records that included at their periphery a series of transactions connecting back to Hardcastle Ventures through a chain of intermediary accounts. He had followed the chain with the methodical, patient attention that was his nature and his training, and what he had found at the end of it was not ambiguous. Elliot Rain had been systematically misdirecting funds from Hardcastle Ventures investment accounts into a series of personal holding structures for a period of at least 22 months. The amounts were significant. The mechanism was sophisticated enough to have been invisible to a general accountant and entirely transparent to Marcus, who had seen this exact structure twice before in his career and had put two previous perpetrators in front of regulators with the documentation to support formal proceedings. The USB drive contained 437 pages of financial records, annotated and sequenced. It contained bank statements, transaction logs, correspondence, and a 17-page summary document written in language clear enough for a court to follow without any assistance. It had been sitting in his jacket pocket for 11 days. He had not yet decided what to do with it. He had been waiting for the right moment, with the patience of a man who understood that timing was the final component of every well-constructed plan. The dinner at the Crestfield Hotel had clarified the timing considerably. The morning after the gala, Marcus was at his desk by 7:30. He worked for 2 hours on client matters with the focused, unhurried discipline that had built his firm from 2 clients to 22, and at 9:30 he called a woman named Harriet Voss. Harriet Voss was a partner at a firm called Whitfield Voss & Associates, specializing in financial litigation and regulatory compliance. She was 53 years old, had been practicing for 26 years, and was the kind of lawyer who made opposing counsel feel the way students feel when they have not studied adequately. She and Marcus had worked together on 3 previous matters. She respected him in the particular way that professionals who have seen each other perform under pressure develop respect, without any of the cushioning that ordinary social courtesy requires. "I have something," he said when she answered. "How significant?" she asked. "Scale of 1 to 10, he said. "I would say a clean 8. There are 22 months of documented transactions. The structure is the Cayman relay method. I've seen it before. The total is approximately 4.3 million. There was a brief silence. "Where and when?" she said. They met at her offices the following morning. Marcus placed a printed copy of the documentation on the conference table, and Harriet read the 17-page summary in 11 minutes, which was faster than most people could manage and which reflected the quality of her attention. She asked 12 questions. Marcus answered all of them from memory. She read sections of the backup documentation. She asked 3 more questions. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at him. "You have had this for 11 days, she said. "I needed to understand the full picture before I acted," he said. "The full picture required some additional time." She looked at him for a moment, with the expression of someone who had been in the profession long enough to recognize the difference between caution and strategy, and who was currently observing strategy. "Is this connected to your personal situation?" she asked. "The evidence was discovered in the course of legitimate professional engagement," he said. "My personal situation is entirely separate. The documentation is what it is, independent of any other consideration." She nodded once. "Options," she said. "I want to understand all of them," he said. "In full." Over 3 hours, Harriet walked him through the complete architecture. The documentation was sufficient to file a formal complaint with the relevant regulatory authority, which would trigger a mandatory investigation. It was additionally sufficient to support civil proceedings for recovery of the misdirected funds. Given the Cayman relay structure, it would almost certainly also draw the attention of the Federal Financial Crimes Unit, whose involvement in these matters tended to accelerate proceedings considerably. There was one additional layer. If Hardcastle Ventures accounts were subject to regulatory investigation, that investigation would almost certainly expand to encompass the full scope of the company's financial practices. Harriet pointed with precise and careful language to a section of the documentation that Marcus had flagged, a series of transactions that bore the distinct fingerprint of a second category of irregularity, separate from Elliot Rain's misdirection. This second category appeared to involve the reporting of investment returns across a portfolio of Hardcastle properties in a manner that was materially inconsistent with what the underlying property valuations could support. "If the investigation goes where the documentation suggests it will go," Harriet said, "the exposure for the principals of Hardcastle Ventures could extend beyond the Elliot Rain matter." Marcus looked at the documents in front of him. He thought about Rosalind's nod at the Crestfield gala, about Brock calling him the bookkeeper at every available opportunity for 7 years, about Diane standing up between the salad and the entree with the measured ease of a woman who had rehearsed her lines. "File the complaint," he said. He said it the way he said most important things, quietly and without unnecessary weight. But it landed in the conference room with the particular gravity of a decision that cannot be undone. Harriet picked up her pen. There was one more thing. Harriet had reviewed the marital asset situation in the preliminary conversation Marcus had had with her office the previous week, and she raised it now in the careful, factual way of a woman who deals in facts for a living. The majority of Marcus's professional assets, his ownership stake in Aldine and Partners, the company's client contracts, its accumulated goodwill, was structured in a way that predated the marriage and had been maintained in forms that were legally distinct from the marital estate. Diane's proposed settlement had been drafted on assumptions about his financial position that were, Harriet said, operating from a significantly incomplete picture. "She believes I am primarily a salaried employee," Marcus said. "Yes," Harriet said. "She has never asked otherwise," he said. It was not a complaint. It was simply an observation, accurate and precise, about the cost of a certain kind of contempt, the kind that decides what someone is worth before examining the evidence. Harriet's office filed the regulatory complaint on a Thursday afternoon. Elliot Rain was notified of the investigation on the following Monday morning. He was suspended from his position at Hardcastle Ventures pending the investigation's outcome. He received notification of the civil recovery proceedings the same day via registered correspondence in an envelope he opened at his desk with the kind of uncomprehending confusion that transitions in approximately 30 seconds into a form of very comprehending panic. He called Diane at 11:43 that morning. Diane was at her own desk at the marketing firm where she worked, a firm whose largest account was a hospitality group in which Hardcastle Ventures held a minority interest, a fact that was about to become significantly more complicated. She heard Elliot's voice, and the quality of it told her immediately, before he had finished his first sentence, that something had gone badly wrong. He spoke for 4 minutes. She asked 2 questions. After the call ended, she sat at her desk for a long time without moving. Then she called her mother. Rosalind Hardcastle received the news in the solarium of her home, the large, light-filled room she used as a home office, surrounded by property documents and the kind of deliberately placed personal objects that communicated a carefully curated narrative about the sort of person who lived there. She listened to Diane's account in a silence so complete it was almost physical. Then she called her lawyer. Her lawyer's response was not what she wanted to hear. He described the documentation as described to him by Harriet Voss's office, with which he was professionally acquainted and for which he had the specific respect of someone who had watched them work before, as thorough, as credible, and as the kind of filing that regulatory bodies do not shelve. He told her the investigation would proceed. He told her the scope could expand. He told her to begin organizing her financial records immediately. She asked about Elliot's culpability and her own exposure. His answer was long and careful and not encouraging. The first audit notice arrived at Harcastle Ventures' registered address 14 days after the regulatory complaint was filed. It was addressed to Rosalind in her capacity as principal officer and covered the preceding 36 months of financial activity. The scope was, as Harriet had anticipated, broader than the Elliot Rain matter. Rosalind read the notice 3 times. Then she opened the bottom drawer of her desk, took out a folder she had compiled in the preceding 10 days, and stared at it for a long time. The folder contained documents she had not shown her lawyer. Not yet. Documents relating to the property valuation irregularities that she had been aware of for considerably longer than anyone currently involved in the investigation would be able to demonstrate. Unless the investigation expanded to the specific set of records it would naturally reach if it proceeded in the direction the documentation pointed. She closed the folder. She put it back in the drawer. She told herself the investigation was a manageable complication. She was wrong. Brock heard from his sister that same evening and reacted the way he tended to react to news that threatened his circumstances, with immediate energy and no particular direction. He called 3 people, had 2 drinks, and by midnight had convinced himself that the matter was fundamentally about Elliot and that his own involvement was tangential and manageable. He was relying on his mother's financial infrastructure for the loan guarantees that underpinned his developer presentation to the world, and if that infrastructure came under formal scrutiny, the exposure was not tangential. His second drink became a third. His certainty did not improve. Marcus was at his desk when Diane called him the following week. He had anticipated the call and had said nothing and waited for it, because patience was not only his nature but his method, and his method had served him consistently well for his entire professional life. Her voice had a quality he had not heard from her in years, something stripped down, something real. The performance was gone, or most of it. There was still a residual attempt at composure, the old reflex of a woman who had spent a long time making sure she was always the most controlled person in any room. But underneath it, clearly audible, was fear. She told him about Elliot and the investigation. She told him about her mother's audit notice. She told him that Brock's loan guarantees were at risk. He listened to everything without interrupting. "This is very bad," she said at the end of it. "Yes," he said, "it is." A pause. "Is there anything you can do?" she asked. The question had several possible meanings. Marcus heard all of them clearly. "What would you expect me to do?" he asked. Another pause, longer. The sound of a woman recalibrating in real time, reassessing a situation she had believed she had completely mapped, discovering that the map was inadequate. "I thought," she began, and then stopped. "I know what you thought," he said, gently, without triumph. Simply as a fact, the silence that followed had a different quality than the previous ones. This one was not strategic. It was the silence of genuine understanding. Partial, arriving late, but arriving. "The accounting," she said at last. Her voice was very quiet. "You found it in the accounting." "I found it in the course of legitimate professional work," he said. "I had a legal and professional obligation to report it. I reported it." She was quiet for a very long time. He waited. "You knew?" she said. "At the gala." "You already knew." "I had known for a while," he said. "I'd been waiting for the right moment to understand the full picture." She said his name then, once, in a voice that had nothing left in it of the woman who had stood between the salad course and the entree at the Crestfield Hotel and performed the final act of her contempt for an audience she had carefully assembled. It was the voice of someone much smaller and more real. "I think we should meet in person," he said. "There are things you need to understand." She came to the house 3 evenings later. The house they had shared for 6 years. The house Marcus paid the mortgage on, whose garden had not been touched in months and which he had begun, in the past few weeks, to quietly restore. She came in through the front door with a key she still had, and he heard the door and came out of his study to meet her in the hallway. She looked at him the way people look at someone they realize they have been seeing incorrectly for a long time. There was something disorienting about him that she could not immediately name, and then she understood what it was. He looked entirely like himself. He was wearing the same kind of clothes he always wore, his desk covered in the same organized stacks of documents, his manner the same quiet, unhurried presence. He had not changed at all. She was the one who had changed, and not in a direction she was proud of. He brought her through to the kitchen and sat across from her at the table and told her everything with the same clean, clear precision he brought to every explanation he had ever given. He told her about Aldine and Partners, its full scope, its market position, its value. He told her about the asset structure and what it meant for the divorce settlement and for any assumptions she had been operating under about his financial position. He told her that his net worth, conservatively assessed, was approximately 14 times what she had believed it to be. The color left her face in stages. He told her about the USB drive, how long he had carried it, what it contained when he had filed the complaint. He told her about Harriet Voss and the regulatory filing. He told her about the scope of the investigation and where it was likely to go. He told her about the second category of irregularities, the property valuation matter, and what his assessment of the investigation's trajectory suggested it would eventually reach. She sat across from him and she did not interrupt once, which was itself remarkable, because Diane Hardcastle-Aldine had been interrupting people her entire adult life. She sat and she listened, and with every sentence her expression shifted further from the composed, armored woman of the Crestfield Hotel and closer to something unguarded and, finally, genuinely present. When he finished, she said nothing for a long time. Then her eyes filled and spilled over, and unlike the gala, unlike every carefully managed performance she had given in the past 7 years of their marriage, she did nothing to manage it. She did not reach for her composure. She simply sat there with tears running down her face and let it be true. "I have wasted so much," she said. He looked at her steadily, not coldly, not with the satisfaction of a man watching a plan complete itself, with the clear, settled sorrow of someone who had genuinely loved a person who chose not to be available to be loved, and who had processed that loss far enough to be sitting with the evidence of it without being destroyed by it. "You spent 7 years deciding what I was worth without examining the evidence," he said. "I want you to understand that this was always your error, not mine. I was always the same person." She looked at him. More tears came and she let them. "The settlement will proceed fairly," he said. "You will receive what you are legally entitled to, calculated precisely. I have no desire to harm you beyond what the legal and financial consequences of this situation require. But I also have no capacity to protect you or your family from what the investigation produces. That is in the hands of the appropriate authorities now, where it belongs." She nodded. It was a small nod, without protest, without negotiation. For the first time in 7 years, she was not performing anything. She left an hour later. At the door, she paused with her hand on the frame and looked back at him in the hallway. "I am sorry," she said. "I know it is inadequate." "I know you are," he said. And because he meant it, because he was a man without cruelty, even when cruelty would have been understandable. She wept again on the doorstep before she pulled herself together and walked to her car. The investigation proceeded with the speed and inevitability of a well-constructed legal process applying itself to well-documented evidence. Elliot Rain was formally charged 6 weeks after the regulatory complaint was filed. The charges were serious, his lawyers were competent and expensive, and ultimately unable to substantially alter the direction of the evidence, which was extensive and precise. He had been, it emerged, conducting relationships with the financial assets of multiple organizations across a career of 14 years, of which the Hardcastle Ventures matter was the most recent and the best documented. The pattern was the kind that forensic investigators recognize with the grim professional satisfaction of a taxonomy confirmed. He cooperated eventually in the way that people cooperate when the alternative has been made clearly and irrevocably unattractive. The scope of the investigation expanded to the property valuation matter on the 43rd day, precisely when Harriet's office had assessed it likely would. Rosalind Hardcastle received notification of the expanded audit by registered correspondence on a Thursday morning, and she sat in her solarium with the envelope open in her hands, and the light coming through the glass in the generous way it did on clear autumn mornings, and she thought about the folder in the bottom drawer of her desk. Her lawyer had been advising her for 3 weeks to disclose the folder voluntarily. She had not done so. This decision was about to become materially and formally relevant to her situation. The expanded audit's preliminary assessment was delivered 12 weeks later. The property valuation irregularities were characterized, in the regulatory authority's language, as systematic and material misrepresentation extending across a period of approximately 4 years. The implications for the company's financial standing, for its operating licenses, its investment structures, its ability to service its obligations, were what Rosalind's accountant had begun calling existential approximately 6 weeks into the process, and what the regulatory document now confirmed in formal, clinical language. Hardcastle Ventures operating licenses were suspended pending the investigation's conclusion. Brock's loan guarantees, backed by the company's property portfolio, were immediately subject to revaluation by the lending institutions. The revaluation was not favorable. Both loans were called in within a week of each other by institutions whose decisions, made independently, reached the same conclusion through the same arithmetic. The guarantees no longer covered the exposure. He called his mother. She did not have the answer he needed. For the first time in Brock Hardcastle's adult life, his mother was not the person who could fix it, not because she lacked the will, but because the tide had gone out far enough to reveal, irrevocably, what had always been beneath the surface. He stood in his apartment on a Wednesday morning, looking at the loan recall notices on his coffee table, and he understood that the presentation he had been giving for 6 years, the car, the sunglasses, the deals perpetually about to close, had been built on a foundation that was never solid, in an environment that was never as secure as it appeared. He was 36 years old and had been performing a version of himself that the underlying reality had never actually supported. This understanding did not arrive with any particular grace. It arrived the way structural truths tend to arrive, suddenly, and with the complete absence of mercy that reality reserves for the things it has been patient about for a long time. Elliot Rain, for his part, was no longer in the picture as far as Diane was concerned. He had removed himself from her life with a speed that was illuminating in its own way. The speed of a man who had always been proximate to resources rather than genuinely attached to people, and who could read the changing tide as fluently as any instrument designed for exactly that. She did not grieve him. The absence of grief told her something about the nature of what it had been. The divorce was finalized 11 months after the evening at the Crestfield Hotel. The settlement was fair, as Marcus had said it would be, calculated precisely, without spite, and without generosity beyond the legal requirement. Diane received what was her legal entitlement from the marital assets, which were, as Harriet's office had carefully established, a modest subset of Marcus's total holdings. She received it without contest and without the counter-proposals her original lawyers had been prepared to make, because her original lawyers had, upon reviewing the full financial picture that Marcus's disclosure produced, advised her with considerable directness that contesting the assessment would not serve her interest. She signed the final documents on a Thursday and drove home and sat in the apartment she had leased under her own name and looked at the walls for a long time. She had the beginning of something that felt like clarity, painful and necessary, the way genuine clarity usually is. She was not a villain in her own mind, which was true of most people who behave badly, and the reckoning now required of her was not the dramatic, public kind. It was the internal kind, the harder kind, the kind that has no audience and no performance, and no exit available that isn't a form of avoidance. She began it. That was what she could say. She began it, which was the most honest thing available to her. Rosalind Harcastle's situation reached its formal conclusion 15 months after the investigation began. The findings were referred to the appropriate prosecutorial authorities. The charges that resulted were not the obliterating kind. She was 61, with a previously clean record, and the legal process reflected that. But they were formal, they were public, and the consequences were lasting. The operating licenses were permanently revoked. The property portfolio, much of it subject to revaluation, and the claims of creditors who had been secured against assets whose stated values were, it turned out, significantly optimistic, was systematically liquidated. The solarium house was sold. The creditors were first in line. After them, the remaining proceeds were modest. Rosalind relocated to a smaller property in a different city, near a sister she had not spent significant time with in years, a woman who had always lived simply and without theatre, and who received her without fanfare and without judgment, and whose company Rosalind found, for reasons she could not immediately articulate, more sustaining than she had expected. She had spent 61 years constructing a version of herself that required a particular audience and a particular stage. The audience was gone. The stage had been sold to settle debts. What remained was the woman underneath the construction, who was smaller and more uncertain and possibly, a more honest beginning than anything she had maintained for the preceding decades. Marcus did not watch any of it with observable satisfaction. He had instructed Harriet's office to manage the legal proceedings and his interests therein with the same professional precision that had characterized everything else. He had done his part. The law had done the rest. That was the correct distribution of roles, and it suited him. He went on with the business of his life, which was, by any reasonable accounting, considerably improved. He expanded Aldine and Partners in the year following the divorce, adding a specialist regulatory compliance division that drew on his own experience and on Harriet's recommendation to 3 significant clients. The firm grew from 22 employees to 31. He moved to larger offices and bought a better parking space, which Diane would have found satisfying as a symbol, and which he found satisfying only as a practical improvement. He endowed a chair at the community college he had attended before his professional qualifications, specifically in financial literacy and forensic accounting, the subjects that had given him every tool he had ever used when it mattered. The endowment was named for no one. He had asked that it carry only the institution's name and the subject's name because he was not interested in monuments. He was interested in outcomes. He also resumed the garden in earnest. He planted things that took time. He was, at this particular point in his life, very comfortable with time. He met a woman named Petra the following spring, at a professional conference where she was presenting on sustainable urban infrastructure, and he was attending a session in the adjacent room and walked into the wrong one and sat through 12 minutes of her presentation before he realized his error and decided that this particular error required no correction. She was 42 and direct and intellectually restless, and laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them, which he found entirely endearing. She had strong opinions about things and stated them clearly, and when he stated his, which was rarely and always with precision, she listened with the full attention of someone who understood that not everything was worth saying, and that things that were worth saying deserved complete attention. He was careful, he was deliberate, he was, month by month, genuinely and durably happy in the way that people become happy when they have stopped requiring anything to be other than what it is. He thought about the Crestfield hotels sometimes in the comfortable and distanced way you think about things that had real weight when they were current, and that time has reduced to something lighter. He thought about Diane standing up between the salad and the entree. He thought about the USB drive in his jacket pocket. He thought about the absolute, uncomplicated certainty with which that room had conspired to make him small. He thought about sitting there and knowing what he knew, and saying 2 words, and leaving. He thought about his office the following morning, and the call to Harriet's office, and the documents placed on the conference table, and the click of a pen. He had not been performing patience at that table at the Crestfield. He had not been pretending to calm he did not feel. He had genuinely, organically been a man who understood that the structure of a situation speaks for itself if you document it correctly and apply it with precision. He had been building that understanding for 15 years. It had never failed him in his work. It had not failed him when it mattered most. His father, a quiet man, a methodical man, a man who had taught Marcus to read a balance sheet at age 12, and who had told him once that the truth of any situation is always in the numbers if you are patient enough to follow them, would have understood completely. He would not have said very much about it. He would have poured a modest drink and sat at the kitchen table and nodded once, in the way of a man whose confidence in a person has been confirmed. Marcus would have liked to tell him. He thought about that sometimes too. The story of a man who is publicly discarded, who holds his ground and who allows the structure of truth to do the work that no amount of raised voices could ever accomplish. That story ends not with a shout or a scene, but with the sound of a garden being tended on a Saturday morning, and coffee made for 2, and the ordinary, hard-won, completely irreplaceable piece of a life built on something real. So what would you have done in Marcus's position? Would you have confronted everything at the table that night, or would you have done exactly what he did? Carried the evidence quietly, documented everything carefully, and let the law do its work? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one, and we want to know what you think. What Marcus Aldine's story teaches us is something worth carrying past the screen and into our own lives. Contempt is always a confession. When someone decides what you are worth without examining the evidence, that decision tells you everything about them and nothing about you. Real worth does not disappear because someone chose not to see it. It continues building quietly and without applause. And when the moment requires it speaks not with noise but with the irrefutable weight of a documented truth. The loudest people in any room are very rarely the most powerful ones. Power built on a solid foundation does not need to announce itself. It simply stands, and when everything built on pretense has been cleared away, it is still standing. If this story meant something to you today, if it gave you something to think about or something to feel. Please give it a like before you go. It helps more people find this channel who might need to hear exactly this kind of story. And subscribe if you haven't yet, because there is so much more coming. I will see you in the next video.